So I thought I'd take a few minutes this morning and talk about what's going on in the legislature this year. And I'm going to start with the budget because, as you know, I'm vice chair of the Assembly Budget Committee, which means I'm deeply involved with the dollars and cents that goes on in Sacramento. This year was particularly challenging because of the epidemic. The statewide shutdown of businesses in California has created a huge problem for taxes in California. In fact, this year we have a $54 billion budget deficit. The big challenge this year is to how to close that budgetary hole because our state constitution requires us to pass a balanced budget every year. So just last week, the legislature passed our version of the budget, and just yesterday we announced a deal with the governor on the various aspects of the budget, and we will be going back to Sacramento on Friday to pass and ratify the budget trailer bills that implement that compromise. So there are some good things and bad things about our budget this year. One of the things that I'm really happy about is that for the last 6 years, I've been a passionate advocate for access to justice, particularly for our district, because a lot of people don't realize it, but the San Bernardino Superior Court system is the most under-resourced court system in the entire state. The problem is that we don't have enough judges. And the formula that we use to set who gets which judges and what courts they go to is one that's rooted in the population figures that are decades old. And so as population has grown here in the Inland Empire, we have run short of judges. In fact, statewide, it's estimated we're short about 171 judges. So every year I've been advocating for that. Some years I get 1 additional judges, some years I get 0, some years I get 2. Last year we got 25, which I'm really happy about because that's making a difference this year because they're allocated in terms of need, in order of need to the Superior Court. So of the 25 that we passed through the budget last year, San Bernardino got the first one, Riverside got the second, San Bernardino got the third, Riverside got the fourth, San Bernardino got the fifth. So So this year we were able to get some more judges through the budget process. In fact, 17 new judges are going to be added to the state rolls. What we did is we reclassified some of the existing sub-positions in the judicial system, reclassified those as judges to give ourselves the room that we needed to do that. So really excited about that. I'm also excited that we were able to push back on a couple of things that tried to do that I personally really disagree with. How many of you are familiar with SB 1? That's the bill that was passed 2 years ago that raised the gasoline and diesel taxes here in California. You may not be aware of it, but SB 1 was implemented on a schedule. So gas tax increases were phased in over several years, and the next one is coming up in August. So gas tax will be going up again in August. And we will then have the highest gas tax of any state in the entire country. So that's something that really, really upsets me because first of all, I voted against SB 1. I believe in funding our roads and our streets, but I also believe that we need to do a responsible job spending the money that people have already given us in terms of gas tax, but we could ask them for more money. And I also very much disagree about raising gas taxes on Californians in the middle of a recession that was caused by a pandemic and government action in shutting down the economy. I spend a lot of time every day listening to stories from my constituents about how they're suffering, how they're hurting, how their businesses closed down, how they can't afford childcare because the school system is closed down. And those stories really tear at your heartstrings. And to hear gas tax going up and making it harder on working Californians really, really makes me mad. So you can imagine how mad I was when I saw the governor proposed to take $130 million from the state highway trust account and put it into the general fund as part of the budget this year. Now you may not remember, but when we passed that gas tax increase, the legislature added an amendment to the state constitution that said that any money collected in gas tax had to be spent on transportation. So you might ask, how could the governor possibly justify taking money out of the state highway account and putting it into the general fund? Well, this is how he said, well, you don't understand, that's interest. That money's sitting there and it's made some interest, and so we're going to sweep that into the general fund. So that really, really upset me because basically he's telling all of us that he knows better what to do with that money than we do, and that money should be spent on things other than streets and roads, which I think is absolutely wrong. So we were able to push back on that. The final version of the budget that we're passing this week does not include that, which I'm very grateful for. However, there's some things that I'm very, very unhappy about in the budget this year. So of that $54 billion budget deficit, we are only cutting state spending by about $8 billion. So if you do the math, that's only about 15% of the deficit that we're actually addressing by reducing state spending. And all of the rest, the 85%, we're addressing through use of what I call budgetary gimmicks. So what gimmicks am I talking about? I mean, I'm talking about things like an interfund loan. So we're doing billions and billions of dollars of interfund loans in the budget this year. So we have a lot of funds in state government that have restricted uses. And I'll give you a couple examples. The Workforce Development Fund is one. The Underground Tank Cleanup Fund is another. So that's money that's assessed against people with underground storage tanks for the purpose of cleaning up spills from underground storage tanks so that they don't become environmental disasters, right? So that money is just sitting there. It can only be used for a restricted purpose, but the state is going to borrow that money, put it into the general fund, and then promise to pay it back later with interest. So that's what's called an interfund loan. So I disagree with that because I think that's a violation of the spirit of the law that says we have to have a balanced budget. I don't think it's a balanced budget if you're borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, because we're going to have to pay that money back later. Another thing that the state is doing this year that I disagree with is something called a deferral. So a deferral is if your car payment is due at the end of the month, and you say, you know what, instead of paying my car payment on the 31st, I'm going to pay it on the 1st of the next month. And that way I'll be able to say when I make my budget that that was next month's bill and not this month's bill. Okay, so we are deferring about $12 billion in K-12 education funds. And we're going to tell schools across the state of California that they have to go dip into their reserves, wait for us to pay them, and then one day into next year, we're going to repay that money. So that's what's called a deferral, and you can see why I'm so upset about it, because it might make things easier budgetarily this year, but is also going to make things much, much harder budgetarily next year. And we are supposed to be the adults in the room. It's supposed to be our job to manage the state budget in such a way that we can say, yes, we're balanced this year, and by the way, we think we've set ourselves out on the path of financial success next year and the year after that. And the scary thing about this is if you look at what the economists are saying about the current recession, they say it is not going to be a single year event from the standpoint of state tax revenues. The forecasts that we have seen show that our economy probably will rebound pretty quickly. But what will not rebound as quickly is employment. In fact, even the optimistic economic projections show that unemployment will not get back to the level it was in California until at 2 years from now. So we're going to be dealing with this issue of budget deficits for the next couple of years, and the actions that we're taking this year in California, unfortunately, just make it much, much harder for us to balance the budget next year and the year after that. So those are things that make me really unhappy about what the state is doing this year. However, one thing that I'm very happy about is we were able to put back in the funding for the Barstow Veterans Home this year. I'm really happy about that. When the governor proposed in his May revise to close the Barstow Veterans Home, I was apoplectic because I think that those veterans are about the last group of people that I would ever choose to violate our promise to and to balance our state budget on the backs of. So we have been fighting to keep that facility open. I'm really happy that the funding was written back in. And the other thing that we did in the budget committee, and as you know, I'm vice chair of budget, is we wrote in something called budget control language. And what we were trying to do is to prevent the governor from just turning around and closing the facility administratively, which he has the power to do. In a way, we're kind of lucky that he tried to close it through a budget action, because that's something that the legislature can act on. So through our budget control language, we wanted to make sure that he couldn't close the home, that Calvet follows its master plan for the home. We wanted to require him to also study the possibility of expanding the skilled nursing facility at the home, because Calvet's problem with the home is that the domiciliary unit, the 50% capacity. And they've been unable to improve on that. And so they point at that and say that's an example of why the home is a failure and is improperly located. But what that doesn't take into account is that the skilled nursing facility has a waiting list. So why would we not use that beautiful facility, maybe scale back the domiciliary unit if you have to, but expand the skilled nursing facility and really take advantage of what that home has to offer. And we also wanted to force Calvet to have a series of meetings with the community and with stakeholders to make sure that our community's voice was heard in whatever decision was made with the home. So I'm happy that most of that budget control language survived. Unfortunately, what did not survive, the governor has changed in this final bill that we're going to be voting on this week. He has changed the part that I put in that says that he can't close the home, and he's going to direct Calvet to, as one of the options, provide an option for full closure of the home to discuss with the community. So I'm not happy about that. But what this means is, first of all, we have succeeded in keeping the home open this year. Second of all, we have, and probably more importantly, we have succeeded in exerting legislative oversight and authority over that home, which means that the legislature is going to be involved with whatever decision gets made full time in the future. And the third thing that we have done here is we have won the battle, but we are still fighting the war. And I want everyone to understand that, because over the next year, it's going to be very, very important for us as a community to engage with Calvet, to participate in these hearings that they're going to be holding, and to make sure that our voices are heard with respect to the future of that facility. So really, really happy we were able to do that this year. It just kind of it was serendipity that the governor tried to do this through the budget in a way that we could influence. But we're going to have to keep fighting the fight, because, as I say, the battle is over now. We won the battle, but we are still fighting the war, and we're going to need everyone to stay engaged as we do that. So another thing I wanted to talk about a little bit today is something that's happening this week in Sacramento, and that is that the Citizens Redistricting Committee is being selected. Now, this is something that happens every 10 years. The lines for the districts, for all of the Assembly districts, the Senate districts, and the congressional districts are redrawn. So they take the total, they have a census, they take the total population of the state of California, and then they divide by the number of districts. So for assembly members like me, they're 80. So they divide by 80. We're about 40 million people in California, so there'll be about 500,000 people in each assembly district. And then the Citizens Redistricting Commission draws the lines to try and make it so that about the same number of people are in each district. So it's a very, very important job that they're doing, and we are one of the few states that delegate this job to a committee of citizens. In a lot of states, it's drawn by the legislature, which is in many cases an excuse for the legislature to what we call gerrymander and write the districts in such ways that benefit themselves politically. And we don't want that to happen in California. But it's really important that we get good people on that commission. So for the last year, the state auditor has been selecting those members. There were thousands and thousands of people who applied. The auditor last year narrowed it down to 120. For the last about 6 months, they've been conducting interviews, in-person interviews for that. They've now narrowed it down to 60. This week, the legislature is exercising its ability to strike certain members. And then on July 2nd, the auditor will conduct a drawing in which it looks a lot like bingo, actually. They've got numbers on ping pong balls, they put them in a big cage, they spin it, and they draw those numbers. And so they're randomly going to select, of the remaining pool, the first 8 committee members, and then that committee of 8 is going to meet to select the final 4. And it's going to be split up. It's evenly split between Democrats, Republicans, and declined to state voters to make sure everyone is represented. So that is what's going on right now in Sacramento. It's going to affect everybody because these district lines are going to change. And if you want my opinion on what's going to happen to us here in the high desert about that, I think that we're going to see some changes, actually. My assembly district, I don't think is going to change very much. The commission is supposed to respect geopolitical boundaries to the extent that they can. So a county, the border of San Bernardino County, is an example of a geopolitical boundary that you don't want to cross unless you have to, because then you'd have to split up the county, where you'd have some members of the county, some residents that were members of one assembly district and some in another. So they don't do that unless they have to, unless there's a compelling reason. So I think that probably we're still going to have one assembly district for most of the high desert. However, I think the state senate districts are going to change a lot. Right now, in my single assembly district, we have state senators. That's very strange when you consider the fact that the Senate districts are twice as big as the assembly districts. So really you should have 2 assembly districts nested in one Senate district. So very odd that we have 3. I think probably that's going to radically change. I think we're probably going to have one state senator that represents all of this area, which is probably going to be a good thing. And the congressional district I also think is going to change. Right now, we are part of the 8th Congressional District that starts down in Highland and goes all the way north to Mono Lake. It's one of the largest congressional districts in the entire country. I don't think that that is going to persist. I think what's going to happen is that the whole top northern half of it's going to get lopped off. So I think we're going to lose all of Inyo and Mono counties, and I think it's going to the south, maybe picking up a little bit of Redlands. But that'll be just fine for us here in the high desert. We'll continue to have a single congressional representative. It's interesting, when you look at how those lines are drawn, you have to look at areas of the state that are experiencing disproportionate population growth. So as a whole, the state's population grow faster than others. And here in the high desert, we have had higher population growth relative to other parts of the state, particularly Los Angeles. So on the whole, our districts are going to shrink a little bit and other districts are going to grow. So that's my prediction. I could very well be wrong. If I am wrong, remember that my advice was worth every bit that you paid for it. So those are the things that I wanted to bring up in our time together today, but I've left a bunch of time here at the end for questions and answers. Happy to answer any questions that you might have about any aspect of state government. Yes, sir.
If I remember correctly, and I could be wrong, there was a surplus last year that was being argued over. Can you remind us what happened to that, and is that being used during this time? Because I know there are arguments made that things could change like this, and that would be a good thing to have it over the side to help us in the bad times.
Yes, that's an excellent point. For the last few years, in fact, we have had large budgetary surpluses in California. And every year, the budget has devolved into an argument between those of us like myself who believe that we should be banking that surplus for future use in times when we have a deficit and the economy is not so strong. Those that wanted to spend it on government programs and expansion of state spending. And sometimes we lost a little, but on the whole, we succeeded in building state budget reserves to the point where we have a higher reserve level now than at any time we ever have in state history. And it's divided up between a number of different kind of pools of revenue, but we have a very healthy budget reserve going into this year. So now we are arguing we should use. And the budget this week in Sacramento proposes to use over half of the existing budget. The existing reserve. And that's something that I am personally, the economists and all of our advisors, the Legislative Analyst Office and the Department of Finance, they all agree that this is not a single year budgetary event, that we're going to have another budget deficit to deal with next year, and very likely one the year after that. So to use over half of our budget reserves this year, I think is irresponsible. But we are fortunate that we have a reserve to draw on, because if we did not, then to balance the budget this year. Yes, sir.
What's that percentage?
Percentage?
For your reserve?
Well, let's see. The question is, what's the reserve compared with the total budget? And let me just do the math here. So our total reserve right now is around $19 billion if you combine the different pools of money. So our general fund is about $210 billion, so approaching 10%. In terms of if you want a percentage of general fund spending, which is probably the closest to apples to local government agencies. So not yet where we wanted it to be. We were hoping to build it up closer to 15 or 20% before we finally said that's enough, we have a sufficient reserve. So obviously we didn't get there, and we're going to spend it all by the time this recession is over. So we're going to have to start over from scratch in building that reserve. Yes, sir.
So I'm just curious on the budget. Homelessness has been kind of this thing talked about, and we're privately funded, so we won't be affected by any kind of tax cuts on the homeless help. But how did it vote in the budget process?
Sure. No, it's a great question. So if you didn't hear, the question is funding for health and human service programs like homelessness, how did they fare in this budgetary cycle and with all the cuts? And the answer is fairly well. the argument actually in the legislature was not about cutting those programs as much as it was an argument between people who wanted to cut education funding and people like myself who feel like education funding is an investment in the future, and cutting funding for education now is just going to have costs associated that we're going to have to pay 5-10 years from now when we have a less educated population. So really we were arguing about whether or not to cut education and not whether or not to cut those programs. A lot of people ask me, because I mean it's easy to play devil's advocate and shake my fist and say, no, we should be cutting more, and a fair question is, okay, what should we be cutting, right? I think that's totally fair. My first answer is the High-Speed Rail Authority. The High-Speed Rail Authority got their budget cut not at all in this budget. They're getting $2 billion of taxpayer money just this year, in a year when we have a $54 billion budget deficit. And by the way, they have almost $1 billion of reserve fund sitting there. And yet the scope of service that they're providing, they're building out a line in the Central Valley from between farming towns essentially that is not going to come close to fulfilling the promises that they made to taxpayers. So that would be job number one that I would cut to balance the budget. Certainly not programs like homelessness, not programs like education. What else can I answer? All right, come back down here, and then I'm going to go over there.
Jay, just a comment and a
The water.
question. A friend of mine who lives up here just retired from one of the big construction companies, and he was on the speed train for 2 years. Said the biggest waste of money he's ever seen. He was a contractor. You've been up there for 6 years. People are moving out of California, where are they moving on in? Does the state legislature, does the governor get why people are moving out of here? Do they even care?
The governor, I know him fairly well. I definitely think he cares that people are leaving, but I do not think that he understands why people are leaving. And if you want an argument for why I feel that way, look no further than a bill that the legislature passed last year called AB 5. And I don't think I've spoken to this group about it, but it is going to decimate business and industry here in California. What it does is it completely rewrites the rules for how employees are classified in California. They're an employee or an independent contractor of a business. For years and years, that test was governed by something called the Borrello test that came out of a Supreme Court decision. And the legislature has thrown it very difficult to classify anyone. And that hurts not only businesses, but it hurts Californians who prefer to control their own schedule, who prefer to decide who they work for and who they don't work for, who prefer to have a couple of different jobs doing different things. And did this bill at the transportation companies like Uber and Lyft. The state was very upset, and some legislators were very upset that these people were being treated as contractors instead of employees. But instead of just targeting them, it applies to all businesses in California. And so it is causing an incredible amount of economic disruption. Instead of fixing that, this is a personal issue for me because I led the opposition to this bill last year when it passed the legislature. And this year I had a bill to create a small business exemption to AB 5. But instead of fixing the problem, the governor is doubling down on enforcement of AB 5. And despite having a $54 billion budget deficit this year, the governor included $20 million for stepped up enforcement of AB 5. So that tells me that no, he does not understand. He doesn't understand how businesses operate, which is ironic because he's a business owner, owns a winery. He doesn't understand how prosperity is created in California, and he doesn't understand why people are leaving California. And I believe that until the people that represent us understand those things, that we're going to continue to see a flight of people out of California, and it's a terrible thing. Yes, sir.
I'm kind of familiar with AB 5 also, and I have a lot of subcontractors in my company that are going to be affected. When are they going to start, when are the rules really going to start coming down?
Well, so AB 5 came out of a Supreme Court decision in a case called Dynamics. And that was a trucking company that was blatantly, no one argues that they weren't blatantly misclassifying their employees. they were driving company trucks on company time, and the company was saying that they were independent contractors, which they should not have been. Even under Borrello, they were misclassified. So when the legislature changed the test, they did it with immediate applicability. So technically, what they said is this is what companies should have already been. Even if you're in a category where the classification was one way under Borrello and another way under AB5, you should have changed January 1st of this year when AB5 officially took effect. So technically, people should already be doing it. The law is so vaguely written that it's very difficult for businesses to try and figure out what rules they ought to be following. And I'll give you an example. One of the most contentious elements of the bill says that you cannot hire someone as a contractor to do work that is in the normal course of business for the work that you do. So for example, if you have a, say you do concerts, and you're going to hire a band to come in and do a gig at one of your concerts. Well, doing concerts is your normal course of business. So, they would argue those people should be classified as employees and not as contractors, even though you're hiring them only to do this one concert. Okay, so the problem is, in that case, it's pretty clear, but in other cases, it's very vague. What does in the normal course of business mean? The law doesn't define it, which is crazy because it just throws it open to the courts. But I'll tell you this, I started my business 30 years ago out of my college dorm room at Caltech. I still have 25 people in our studio that I employ. I'll tell you this, with 100% certainty I can say I would have not been able to start a business here in California if AB5 had been the law of the land. It's just too overwhelming to have to scale a business with employees. Because when you hire someone, you don't want to lay them off, you don't want to fire them. When you're adding business capacity, the way that you do it is incrementally with contract work. And then when you get to a point where, systemically you can support an employee full-time, then you hire them full-time. So we started off with contract labor, and there's no way we would have been able to make it work with the current law. And it breaks my heart because I've got kids, and they would like to start businesses of their own one day. They look at what I've done, and they view that as kind of the want that for themselves and their families. And I don't think it's possible for them to do that here, and that's a shame. Yes, ma'am.
For promoting change, the National Notary Association requested all of us as notaries who are members, or share the wealth, I guess, share the information, to send letters saying what are on our business letterhead, saying what we do, so that we don't have to, because we fall under them. We're not, if we don't ask for an exemption specifically, what are we going to do as far as loan signings or basic notary? We got to pay somebody a payroll when that person collects the money on their own. I don't collect the money. The notaries that I don't even contract them. I just, are you available? They go.
Yep, that's an excellent point, and that's yet another problem with this law as it applies to business. My view on legislation, good and bad, is that when we write legislation, it should be clear, because specificity in the law avoids people not knowing what they're supposed to do and what they can and can't do. And I think it ought to apply to everybody. It should be as short as possible and as specific as possible. And AB5, the problem is, if you read the legislation, the first couple of pages say, okay, here are the new rules for worker classification in California. And then the next 30 pages are page after page of exception, except for real estate agents. Here are the rules for them. Except for commercial fishermen, here are the rules for them. And it goes on and on and on. And although I'm happy that certain industries were able to hire lobbyists and get themselves exceptions written into them, it's an illustration that the law is a bad law, because it can't be applied equally to everybody. So notaries, which is nice. Yeah. The legislature passed another 2 bills just in the last couple of weeks that are creating new exemptions for industries that are problematic. But unfortunately, it's just scratching, the tip of what needs to be done to fix the law. What else can I answer for you? All right, well, I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to come speak to the group. It's always wonderful to be here. I want to close by giving you a pitch for our district office, because sometimes when I come to a group like this and I talk about Sacramento and legislation and votes, and people get the idea that the reason why you have an assemblyman is the important thing that I do. The reason why you have a state representative is so that you have a voice, an advocate in your corner when you have a dispute with your state government. And those disputes come up all the time. Think about if you've ever had a problem with the DMV, because who's ever had a problem with that wonderful agency, right? Think about just recently in the pandemic, if you've had a problem with the EDD on unemployment insurance. You've got a claim that you filed, you can't get the you think it's unfair. The next time that happens, would you please call me? Because that's the reason we are here. I've got a district office here in Hesperia that is staffed with people that have a heart for constituent services. And when you come to us with a problem, the people that we can call are different from the people that you can call when you call the 800 number on your statement. You know, these are people that problems for our constituents. And the last thing that they want is some assemblyman knocking on their door. Particularly not, by the way, the assemblyman who's vice chair of the committee that sets their budget every year. So when we call, we can be really effective in solving problems for you. We can solve problems in a day that you have banged your head against for the last 6 months. So please, I'm gonna leave a stack of business cards up here. If you take nothing away from our time together today but this, please grab a card, throw it in a drawer, and the next time you have a problem with any agency of state government, please give us a call and let us help you. So I'm Assemblyman Jay Obernolte. It's an honor to represent you. It was an honor to be here today.